First time most people see a black swan, something happens that is difficult to name precisely. It is not quite surprise. It is something closer to wrongness, a visual disruption. The brain reaches for the category it knows, swan, and finds the object in front of it does not match the template. White neck, orange bill, that specific silhouette on the water. Everything about the shape is right. Everything about the color is not. And for a moment, before the mind catches up, the animal in front of you feels like something that should not exist. That feeling has a history. And the history is more interesting than most people realize. For most of human recorded history, the black swan did not exist. Not because it had not been discovered yet, in the way that new species are discovered, quietly by scientists in the field, filing papers that the public never reads. It did not exist in a more fundamental sense. The phrase black swan was, in European languages, a byword for impossibility, a Latin expression used by Roman poets to mean something that could never happen. Rara avis in terris nigroque similima signo, a rare bird on earth, very like a black swan. The point of the phrase was that there was no such thing. The black swan was the example you reached for when you wanted to describe something that could never be. And then, in 1697, a Dutch expedition reached the western coast of what is now Australia, and the impossible was standing on the riverbank. What happened next? What the black swan actually is, how it ended up on the other side of the world from where swans were supposed to live, and what it does differently from every other swan on Earth, is a story that runs from evolutionary biology through colonial history, through modern urban ecology. And it ends somewhere that I think will genuinely surprise you. Number 1. Where black swans actually come from, and why their existence upended more than ornithology. The black swan, Cygnus atratus, is native to Australia. It evolved on a continent that was separated from the rest of the world's land masses for tens of millions of years, developing in isolation from the swan lineage that produced every white species. The shared ancestry is real. The genus Cygnus connects them, but the separation is long enough and deep enough that the black swan arrived at its current form through a completely independent evolutionary path. The color is not a mutation. It is not an aberration. It is not what happens when something goes wrong with a white swan. Black plumage in Cygnus atratus is the normal, healthy, selected-for outcome of millions of years of evolution on a continent with different predators, different vegetation, different water systems, and different light conditions than the European and Asian environments that produced white swans. The question of why black, specifically, is one that researchers have approached from several directions. One hypothesis involves thermoregulation. Dark plumage absorbs more solar radiation than white plumage, which may provide a thermal advantage in the variable temperature conditions of southern Australia, where winter nights can be genuinely cold and summer days can be extreme. Another involves predator detection. In the specific light conditions of Australian wetlands, the visibility profile of a black bird on dark water may differ from what it would be in European contexts, in ways that affected historical predation pressure. Neither explanation is complete. The honest answer is that we understand the fact of the black swan's coloration more clearly than we understand the full evolutionary logic that produced it. What is clear is that the color works. The black swan is not a failed white swan. It is a successful black one, on its own terms, in its own environment, for its own reasons. The philosophical consequence of its discovery was, in the long run, almost as significant as the biological one. The European certainty that swans were white, that whiteness was simply what swans were, had been built on the observation of every swan that Europeans had ever seen. It was not an unreasonable conclusion. It was just wrong. And its wrongness, once demonstrated, forced a reckoning with how observation-based certainty actually works. You can observe a thing 1,000 times and still not have observed it completely. The 1,001st observation can overturn everything. The philosopher Nassim Nicholas Taleb built an entire framework for thinking about rare, high-impact, unpredictable events around this image. The Black Swan event. Something that was considered impossible right up until it happened. The bird on the Australian riverbank in 1697 became a way of thinking about the limits of what we believe we know. A shorthand for the category of things that cannot happen until they do. All of that started with an actual bird, standing on an actual riverbank, looking to the Dutch sailors watching it, like something that should not exist. Number 2. What makes the black swan biologically different from every other swan? Color aside, the black swan is not simply a dark version of a mute swan. The differences run deeper than plumage, and some of them are significant enough to make the black swan a genuinely unusual member of its genus. The neck is the most immediately obvious structural difference. The black swan has the longest neck relative to body size of any swan species. It is not a subtle difference. A black swan's neck contains more cervical vertebrae than any other swan, and the resulting length and flexibility gives it a feeding reach that other swans cannot match. In deep water or in dense aquatic vegetation, the black swan can access food sources at depths that would be unreachable for a mute swan of equivalent body size. The voice is completely different. Mute swans are not actually mute. They produce a range of sounds, but they are relatively quiet birds by waterbird standards. The black swan is vocal in a way that is immediately striking to anyone who has spent time near them. It produces a high, bugling call that carries across considerable distances. Pairs and groups communicate constantly with a range of calls that researchers have only partially mapped. A lake with black swans on it sounds different from a lake with mute swans. Not slightly different, completely different. The breeding biology has a feature that is unique among swans and rare among birds generally. Black swans are occasionally polygamous. While the majority of pairs are monogamous in the conventional sense, male-male pairs have been documented forming bonds, acquiring eggs through various means, including taking over nests from female-male pairs and raising cygnets together successfully. The rate of same-sex pairing in black swans is higher than in any other swan species and represents one of the better documented examples of this behavior in wild birds. The cygnets raised by male-male pairs in documented studies showed survival rates comparable to those raised by mixed-sex pairs. The breeding season itself is timed differently from Northern Hemisphere swans. Black swans in their native Australia breed in the cooler months, the austral winter and spring, which is the reverse of the Northern Hemisphere pattern. This creates a specific challenge for black swans that have been introduced to the Northern Hemisphere, which is, it turns out, most of the black swans outside Australia. Number 3. The global spread, and what it has actually meant for the places black swans arrived. Black swans exist on every inhabited continent now. Not because they migrated there, because humans took them. The pattern began almost immediately after European contact with Australia. Black swans were transported to Europe as ornamental birds, to be kept on the lakes of estates and parks, where their visual novelty made them status objects. They were beautiful. They were strange. They were unlike anything European landowners had seen. By the 18th and 19th centuries, black swans were present on private and public waters across Britain, continental Europe, and eventually North America. Some of them escaped. Some were released. And in places where the conditions were suitable, they established wild and feral populations that have been breeding independently of human management ever since. In New Zealand, the story is particularly striking. Black swans were introduced in the 19th century and established populations in several major wetland areas. They have since become one of the dominant large water birds in certain New Zealand ecosystems. The Te Waihora Lake System on the South Island now holds one of the largest black swan populations outside Australia, with tens of thousands of birds at peak counts. In Britain, black swans breed in the wild in small numbers. In the Netherlands, in Sweden, in parts of Germany, established feral populations exist. In Japan, black swans introduced to parks and botanical gardens have spread beyond their original locations. In the United States, birds that escaped or were released from private collections appear regularly at lakes across the country. What this means ecologically is contested and genuinely complicated. In New Zealand, black swans in high densities have been associated with significant impacts on aquatic vegetation beds, grazing them down in ways that affect other species that depend on the same habitat. In British and European contexts, the populations are generally small enough that ecosystem-level impacts are limited, but the birds occupy the same feeding niche as mute swans and compete directly with them where both species are present. The black swan arrived in Europe as an impossibility and stayed as an invasive. The philosophical import and the ecological reality turn out to be very different things. Number 4. How black swans actually behave. What you see at the water versus what is actually happening. People who encounter black swans at parks and public lakes often remark on something that is difficult to articulate. The birds seem different from mute swans in a way that goes beyond color. Less ponderous, more alert, more vocal, more socially active. This impression reflects something real. Black swans are more gregarious than mute swans. In their native Australian habitat, they form large flocks on major wetlands, sometimes numbering in the thousands. The territorial exclusivity that defines mute swan social organization, one pair, one stretch of water, aggressive exclusion of competitors, is less dominant in black swan behavioral ecology. Black swans will tolerate the proximity of other black swans at feeding areas with a flexibility that a territorial mute swan would not. Flock feeding, communal roosting in larger groups, and more fluid social arrangements are all features of black swan behavior that distinguish them from their white relatives. The pair bond is real and strong, as it is in all swans, but the social context around the pair is more permeable. A black swan pair on a lake with other black swans is not running the same exclusion imperative that a mute swan pair runs. They are managing a social environment that includes more individuals, more interaction, more vocal negotiation of space and access. What this looks like to a casual observer is a livelier, noisier, more socially complex scene than a mute swan lake typically presents. Whether you find this more or less appealing than the austere territorial calm of a mute swan pair probably depends on what you came to the water looking for. Number 5. The wrongness feeling and what it actually tells you. I want to come back to where we started. That feeling when you first see a black swan. The wrongness, the visual disruption, the sense that the object in front of you does not match the category your brain has prepared for it. That feeling is not irrational. It is information. Your brain built the category swan from every swan it had ever seen or been told about. White, orange bill, that silhouette. The category was accurate for its sample. The sample was incomplete. The black swan is the object that reveals the incompleteness. This happens everywhere, not just in ornithology. Every system of knowledge is built from observations. Every set of observations is finite. Somewhere, on a riverbank that has not been reached yet, there is the thing that does not match the category. The thing that makes the certain uncertain. The thing that looks, until you see it, like something that should not exist. The Dutch sailors in 1697 experienced that moment on a literal riverbank with a literal bird. You can experience a version of it at any public lake that keeps black swans, which is most of them now, because humans decided that the impossible animal was too beautiful to leave on the other side of the world. Stand at the edge of that water. Look at the black swan moving across it. Let the wrongness feeling arrive. It is not telling you that something is wrong. It is telling you that your category was smaller than the world. That is almost always worth knowing. Tell me in the comments, the first time you saw a black swan in person, what did it feel like? Did it look wrong to you, or did it look like something else entirely? I want to know exactly what you saw and what you thought. I read every one.